Have you ever wondered if love is truly worth the sacrifices we make for it? What if the love you're chasing is slowly chipping away at your self-worth? In today's video, we're going to explore the powerful and emotional journey of a 70-year-old man who took a leap of faith in love, only to find himself on the edge of losing everything he valued about himself. Stay with us until the end of this video because you're about to discover the true cost of chasing love at any age. This story isn't just about romance. It's about dignity, self-respect, and the hard lessons we learn when we sacrifice too much for someone else's approval. By the end, you'll have valuable insights into the kind of love that's worth fighting for, and more importantly, the kind that isn't. Why should you watch this video? Because in every relationship, there's a tipping point between love and loss of self. This man's story is a stark reminder that no matter your age, you deserve to be loved for who you truly are, not just for what someone else wants you to be. You'll walk away with crucial lessons on boundaries, self-respect, and how to protect your heart from being manipulated. If you're struggling with a similar situation, or simply want to understand the powerful psychology behind why we sometimes lose ourselves in love, this video will offer you the clarity and courage you need to make the right choices in your relationships. So, stay tuned, and let's dive in. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. From the very first moment their paths intertwined, something inexplicable sparked within him. He knew, with a clarity that cut through the noise of his life, that this relationship would not be easy. It wasn't just the weight of years or the shadows of past disappointments that loomed over him. It was the sense that fate itself had laid a challenge before him. His friends, those old voices who had once shared his youthful dreams and ambitions, looked on with furrowed brows and murmurs of doubt. They watched from the sidelines, uncertain of what they were seeing, and whispered their concerns in hushed tones. They meant well, of course, but there was a sharpness in their skepticism, a kind of disbelief in their eyes that felt almost like a silent judgment. Even his children, the flesh of his flesh, the ones he had nurtured and guided through life, could not hide their apprehension. Their worry was not wrapped in the soft fabric of concern, but in the stark honesty of truth. They were direct, almost painfully so. Their voices, thick with the weight of years spent observing their father, issued warnings with the kind of bluntness that only a child can afford. They feared for him, not just because of the age difference or the unknowns that lurked in the future, but because they had seen him hurt before. They had witnessed the bruises of past love and the scars time had left on his spirit. To them, it was an unnecessary risk, an impossible gamble. They couldn't understand why, at this stage in his life, he would venture into such a fragile, unpredictable thing as love again. Yet, despite the concerns of those around him, despite the tightening of his chest and the gnawing doubts that crept into his thoughts late at night, he felt an undeniable pull toward her. Deep in the quiet recesses of his mind, where his most honest thoughts and hidden fears resided, he too wondered if this was truly a wise decision. Should he risk his heart once more? Was it worth challenging everything, even his own children's love, for a chance at something he could barely define? It was in these solitary moments of reflection that doubt would whisper in his ear, making him question his judgment. But no matter how deep the voice of reason tried to reach him, there was something louder, something more powerful, a longing, a desperate, burning desire that refused to be silenced. At 70, when so many of his peers had long since settled into a rhythm of quiet resignation, he still felt an unyielding fire burning within him. It was a fire not of recklessness but of defiance. His soul rebelled against the tyranny of age, against the expectations that society had quietly placed on him. It wasn't just about stubbornness, it was about the undeniable urge to live. He had lived his life as a dutiful man, a responsible man, one who had always put others first. But now, standing at the precipice of his twilight years, he was driven by something deeper, something more primal. He yearned for a connection, a bond that could reawaken the passions he feared had long since been extinguished by time. He longed for that thrilling, heart-pounding kind of love, the kind he had known when he was young before the weight of responsibilities, disappointments, and unfulfilled dreams had dulled his senses. He longed to feel the pulse of life in his veins again, to know that he was still capable of loving without limits, of feeling without reservations. This was no passing fancy or naive wish. It was an aching, all-encompassing need, a part of him that had been buried under years of experience, now rising to the surface like a forgotten treasure. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. What began as a cautious, even hesitant step into the realm of romance soon blossomed into something far more intense. At first, he had approached her with a careful sense of restraint, unsure of how deep he should allow his feelings to go. But soon, the flicker of hope turned into a blazing flame. His heart, long closed off and scarred by the passage of years, began to open in ways he hadn't imagined possible. What started as a tentative exploration of love rapidly spiraled into an all-consuming passion. It was as if he had been starved for connection, and now that he had tasted it, he couldn't stop. He poured everything he had into this relationship. His heart, his energy, his soul. Every conversation, every touch, every glance was a lifeline, a thread that connected him to a world he had once thought beyond his reach. To him, this was no ordinary relationship. It was a once-in-a-lifetime love. He treated it as such, with a kind of reverence and devotion that only comes when a person knows they are standing on the precipice of something rare and precious. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that this was his last great love, his final chance to feel the depth of emotion that had eluded him for so many years. And in his pursuit of this love, he did not notice the price he was paying, did not see the toll it was taking on him, body and soul. It was only later, when his heart had already been irrevocably entangled, that he would begin to feel the weight of what he had given up. But by then, it would be too late. His heart was already too deeply invested, and the possibility of turning back would no longer exist. In the beginning, everything seemed almost too good to be true. She entered his life like a breath of fresh air, a dazzling light that illuminated the corners of his heart he had thought dark and forgotten. She was everything he had missed, a confidant, a lover, a spark that brought warmth to his weary bones. Her words, so sweet and gentle, wrapped around him like a blanket of comfort. Each compliment she offered was like a small miracle, a reminder of a vitality he had long since abandoned. Her eyes, bright and filled with warmth, saw him, not the tired, aging man he had become, but the person he once was. She saw his charm, his wit, his strength, and she loved him for it. With each look, each touch, she made him feel young again, as if the years had melted away. Her affection awakened something inside him that he had forgotten, a strength, a vitality, a sense of worth that had been lost under the weight of decades. When she looked at him, it was as if time itself slowed. In those moments, he felt invincible, as if he could defy the relentless march of age and reclaim the essence of his youth. He was reminded of a time when love was a promise, unspoken yet understood, a time when every glance, every touch, was an adventure in itself. With her, he felt capable of conquering anything, of rewriting his own story. She had breathed new life into him, and in doing so, she had restored his belief in the power of love, the power of connection. Every moment with her felt like a gift, a treasure he was determined to hold onto with all the strength he had left. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream, not just of a future together, but of a life full of passion, possibility, and love that could transcend the limits of time itself. He responded to her with a fervor that consumed him, treating her with a level of care and devotion that he had reserved only for the most cherished people in his life. Every interaction, every word spoken, every act of kindness he offered was soaked in a tenderness that reflected how deeply he admired her, how profoundly he was captivated by her presence. He couldn't help but shower her with gifts, extravagant, thoughtful, and frequent, each one an expression of his affection, each one an attempt to make her feel like royalty. It wasn't enough just to love her. He wanted her to feel as though she were the center of his world, the very reason for his existence. He found himself constantly praising her, filling her ears with words of adoration, admiring her beauty, intelligence, and grace as if he were witnessing a miracle. A woman like her, so perfect, so extraordinary, walking into his life when he least expected it, when he thought he had given up on miracles altogether. To him, she was nothing less than a gift from the heavens, a rare and precious jewel that he would treasure for as long as he lived. But even amidst the sheer bliss of this intoxicating love, there were hints of something darker, something subtle that crept into his awareness like a shadow on the edge of his happiness. At first, her demands were almost imperceptible, so small and seemingly insignificant that he barely noticed them. A simple suggestion here, a request wrapped in the sweetness of her smile, a preference mentioned in passing. It was nothing he couldn't handle, nothing that seemed unreasonable or burdensome. He eagerly accepted each request, eager to see her smile, eager to feel the warmth of her affection. He believed that this was what love was. Sacrificing a little bit of himself, bending just a little, to make her happy. He believed that each small act of compliance was an expression of his love, a gesture of devotion that would only draw them closer together. But soon, those little requests began to grow, almost imperceptibly at first, like the softest whispers in the wind, until they became demands that were impossible to ignore. Her voice, once playful and light, carried a new edge, a tone of superiority that he mistakenly mistook for confidence. It wasn't loud or brash, but it was there, a subtle undertone that suggested she expected more from him, that she was beginning to see herself as something elevated, perhaps even above him. At first, he was drawn to this assertiveness, intrigued by her self-assurance, charmed by the way she knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to ask for it. It felt like a game, a dance, and he willingly followed her lead, believing it was a sign of her strength, of her desire to shape a future with him. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was how she was slowly molding him into someone he hadn't planned to become. Each time he gave in, each time he adjusted his behavior or his plans to accommodate her, he lost a small part of himself. But he dismissed it, telling himself that it was just part of the thrill of new love, that it was normal to change a little for someone you cared about, and that each small compromise was a stepping stone toward a deeper connection. He told himself that as long as it made her happy, it was worth it. He believed that each change, no matter how slight, was a step closer to her heart, that with every shift, he was proving his love to her in ways that she would cherish forever. Yet, as the months slipped by, something began to shift, something deep and unsettling. The warmth that had once enveloped them, the passion that had burned brightly between them, began to cool, like embers fading to ash. Her smiles became fewer, her touch less tender, her words more distant. The affection that had once flowed so freely between them now felt strained, as if there were an invisible wall between them, something neither of them could cross. And then, her behavior began to change too. Her kindness, which had once been a balm for his soul, began to feel hollow. It was still there, but it was laced with something darker, something colder. There was a sense of superiority in her actions, a quiet disdain that flickered in her eyes whenever he did something wrong, whenever he failed to meet her increasingly higher standards. The playful remarks, which once filled the air with lightness and joy, began to sting. What had once been charming teasing now felt like biting critiques, sharp, cutting, and meant to wound. He found himself unable to keep up, unable to make her smile as easily as before, unable to please her the way he once had. What once felt like a game now felt like a test he was losing over and over again. Her words lingered in his mind long after they were spoken, their meaning and weight growing heavier with each passing day. He told himself that it was just a phase, that the honeymoon period had ended, and that love wasn't always easy, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more insidious was taking root. As the days stretched into months, he began to wonder if he had truly lost himself in the process. Every change he made to accommodate her, every sacrifice he had willingly offered, now felt like a small betrayal of the person he had once been. But how could he walk away from this love? How could he admit that the very thing he had fought for, the very thing he had so desperately wanted, might not be the love he thought it was at all? He had fallen too deeply into the web of her affection, too deeply into the belief that this was the love he had always dreamed of. But now, as her coldness grew more apparent, as the criticism became more biting, he found himself questioning whether he was truly loved at all, or if he had simply been a pawn in her game, a man shaped and molded to fit her desires, at the cost of his own identity. With every word she spoke, every glance she gave him, he felt himself shrinking, becoming a version of himself he didn't recognize. But he couldn't leave, he couldn't walk away from her now. Not when he was so deeply entwined in the idea of who they were, not when his heart still believed in the fairy tale he had created for them both. So he stayed, quietly enduring the change, hoping against hope that one day, the warmth would return, and that the woman he had fallen in love with would resurface. But with each passing day, that hope seemed to slip further and further away. "Men your age really should take better care of themselves," she would say, her lips curling into a slight, almost pitying smirk, as if he were nothing more than a project, a problem to be solved, a challenge to be fixed. Her words, so light and casual on the surface, carried the weight of years of unsaid judgments, as if she saw him as less than he was, something worn down and forgotten, fading into irrelevance. At first, he tried to laugh it off, telling himself that it was just a joke, some harmless teasing, nothing to take seriously. But the jokes kept coming, each one more biting than the last, each one digging deeper into a place he had worked so hard to protect. And with each cruel quip, he felt his self-worth slip a little more, like sand through the cracks of his fingers. What had started as playful banter began to feel like a relentless assault, an attack on his very being. He could feel it eating away at him, undermining the quiet confidence he had built up over the years, until it felt like he was nothing more than a hollow shell of the man he used to be. Over time, he started to believe the words she said, even when he tried not to. He began to look at himself in the mirror, tracing the lines that had formed in his face, the gray hairs that now peppered his temples, the sagging muscles that weren't what they used to be. With each passing day, he felt more like a stranger in his own body. Someone who had outlived his usefulness, someone who wasn't young enough to keep up with the woman he had fallen in love with, yet too desperate to let go. The worst of it came when she turned her criticisms toward the one thing he had always believed was sacred between them, their intimacy. For him, love wasn't just about passion or fleeting physical desire. It was about connection, an unspoken bond that could be felt in the quiet moments, in the tenderness of a touch, in the warmth of shared silence. He had always thought that intimacy was something deeper than the superficial. It wasn't just about youth, vigor, or lust. It was about giving and receiving in ways that transcended the physical. But to her, that understanding was becoming irrelevant. She no longer saw him as a lover, as a partner, but as someone who had become outmoded, like an outdated device that could no longer fulfill its purpose. She began to pick him apart, piece by piece, targeting his weaknesses in the most vulnerable places. His body, his energy, his desire. "You're so slow," she would say, as if the pace of his lovemaking were a failing, a flaw that could never be excused. "You're so predictable." The words hung in the air, heavy with disappointment. And when she spoke of their physical connection, there was no tenderness in her voice, only sharp, cutting criticism. She talked about the passion of youth, the vitality that she thought should come with love, but he could never give her. She told him he lacked the vigor, the fire of a younger man, the kind of energy she seemed to crave, to demand, like it was the only thing that mattered. Every word she uttered felt like a wound being inflicted deeper and deeper, until he didn't recognize himself anymore. It wasn't just his body she was tearing apart, it was the very essence of who he was, what he had to offer. He felt diminished, unworthy, as if the man who had once stood tall with pride had been reduced to a pitiful imitation of the man he used to be. Her criticism struck him where he was most vulnerable. He wasn't a young man anymore. He had passed that phase of his life, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. But what hurt the most was that she couldn't see past the surface, the years he had lived, the wisdom he had gained, the depth of love he had to offer. She seemed to only care about the physical, the immediate, the visible. He wanted to tell her that there was more to love than just the fleeting moments of desire, more than just the physical rush of youth. But each time he tried, his words fell flat, dismissed as irrelevant, outdated. The deeper he fell into this despair, the more he realized how powerless he was to fix what had been broken. Desperate and clinging to the last shreds of his dignity, he took one final step, a quiet plea, a desperate attempt to show her that there was still value in what he had to offer. With all the vulnerability in his heart, he tried to show her the one thing a younger man couldn't, the wisdom of a lifetime, the tenderness of a heart that had seen the world, that had loved fully and completely. He spoke to her not just as a lover, but as a man who had learned to cherish the small, quiet moments, the moments that could never be recreated by youth or energy. He shared his truth with the hope that she would see the beauty in their connection, the unique depth of what they had built together over the years. But instead of understanding, she met him with cruelty. She laughed, mockingly, bitterly, as though his words had no worth. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of dismissal, of contempt. It shattered him, her mockery cutting deeper than any criticism before it. His words, his vulnerability, his effort to reach her, they all turned into something pitiable in her eyes. She didn't see him anymore. She saw only the flaws, the imperfections, the things she could never accept. Her laugh echoed in his ears, stripping him of every ounce of dignity he had left, leaving him feeling small and insignificant. The love he had once believed in, the bond they had once shared, felt like a distant memory, replaced now by the hollow sting of her scorn. The mockery was like salt on an open wound, and each cruel word she spoke was like another wound being carved into his very soul. With every laugh, every dismissive comment, every cold rejection, he could feel himself slipping further away from the man he used to be. And as the final threads of his pride unraveled, he stood there, broken and alone, a man whose love had once burned bright, now extinguished by the cold winds of her disdain. Humiliated and shattered, he clung to the fragile hope that what he was enduring was nothing more than a passing phase, a cruel test of his resilience and his unwavering devotion to her. He told himself that with enough time, enough patience, and an endless well of understanding, she would finally recognize the profound depth of his commitment, the quiet, steadfast love that had woven itself into the very fabric of his being. Each day, as it turned into the next, he forced himself to believe that if he just held on a little longer, just tried a little harder, she would see beyond the surface and come to appreciate him for who he truly was. His love was pure, he told himself. It was the kind of love that could heal, that could transform, if only given the right opportunity. He believed, with all the sincerity of his heart, that the strength of his affection would eventually break through the walls she had built around herself, that his loyalty and his devotion would win her over, that one day she would understand how much he had given, how far he had gone to love her, and how deeply he cherished her. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks bled into months, his hope began to wither like a flower in a harsh, unrelenting winter. The more he waited, the more he loved, the deeper the wounds became. Her words, once sweet and endearing, had started to take on a bitter edge, a sharpness that cut through him like a knife. Each cruel remark, each dismissive gesture, seemed to chip away at his soul, slowly dismantling the foundation of his self-worth. He had tried to be patient, tried to be understanding, but the weight of her indifference bore down on him with the force of an avalanche, and with each passing day, he found himself sinking deeper into a dark, desolate place. What had once felt like devotion now seemed like self-doubt, and every loving gesture he made seemed to fall flat, met with an indifference that slowly gnawed away at his spirit. The love that had once burned so brightly now flickered weakly, like a candle in the wind, and he began to feel as though he was being consumed by a slow, unrelenting fire that left nothing but ashes in its wake. In the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect, he started to see himself through her eyes, through the eyes of someone so young, so full of life, and so clearly moving in a different direction. He began to feel like nothing more than an aging relic, a man past his prime, with little left to offer someone who had so much to look forward to. She made him feel invisible, as though he had become a shadow of himself, something irrelevant, something easily discarded. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. She had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, reduced him to someone who was less than human, someone whose value had expired. His sense of self-worth, once strong and solid, was now fractured, a million pieces scattered like glass across the floor. He had become a ghost of the man he once was, a man who had dared to believe that love could overcome all obstacles. And now, in the cold, harsh reality of her neglect, he was left questioning whether he had been foolish to believe in something so intangible, so fragile. To the outside world, his decision to stay might have seemed utterly baffling, even pitiable. His friends, who had watched helplessly as he slowly withered under her coldness, questioned why he allowed himself to be treated like this. Why, they asked, did he endure such pain? Why did he remain in a relationship where he was clearly unwanted, clearly discarded? Why did he subject himself to being diminished by someone who had never truly seen him, who had only seen him as a means to an end? They couldn't understand the strange, inexplicable power of love, the kind of love that blinds you to the faults of the one you love, the kind of love that binds you to them even as they tear you apart. For those who have never loved deeply, never allowed themselves to be consumed by something so powerful, it was impossible to understand. But for him, leaving wasn't a choice. It wasn't just about love, it was about identity, about who he was, who he had become in the shadow of her presence. His love had taken root so deeply in his soul, it had become part of his very essence. It wasn't something he could walk away from, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much he suffered. In a way, he was trapped by his own emotions, by a need for validation, a desperate longing for a love that had once felt like salvation. He clung to the memories of her early sweetness, the small moments when her touch had been tender, when her smile had made him feel young again, when she had looked at him not as a man past his prime, but as someone worthy of love. Those fleeting moments were etched in his memory like a beautiful, bittersweet melody, a song he couldn't forget even as the world around him grew quieter and colder. And despite everything, the hurt, the disappointment, the brokenness, he couldn't let go. He stayed because the memory of that love was too powerful, too intoxicating to abandon, even though it had now become his deepest sorrow. But then, one night, after yet another brutal exchange where her words had left him feeling small and insignificant, something inside him shifted. He stood there in the silence, in the aftermath of the confrontation, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to look inward. He stood before the mirror, staring at the reflection that had once been so familiar, but now seemed like a stranger. The man looking back at him was 70 years old, his face etched with the lines of a lifetime that had been full of joy, of pain, of love, of loss. But in those lines, he saw not just age, but strength. He saw the marks of resilience, of a man who had fought through every storm life had thrown at him, and who had emerged stronger, wiser, though a little wearier. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now weighed down by the years of both joy and sorrow they had witnessed. But in that moment, in the stillness of his gaze, he understood something he had been too blind to see before. He wasn't just an aging man, a relic of the past. He was someone who had lived, who had loved, who had learned from the passage of time. He realized that his worth was not tied to her approval, her perception of him, or the fleeting beauty of youth. His worth lay in who he was, his experiences, his character, the strength that came from surviving life's most brutal tests. Self-love, he realized, needed to rise above the silence, louder than any voice that had ever belittled him. He no longer needed her validation. He no longer needed to be seen through the lens of her youth or her fleeting affection. He had earned his place, he had earned his strength, and he would no longer allow himself to be diminished by someone who could never accept him as he was. In that moment, with a clarity that cut through the fog of self-doubt, he made a vow to himself, to stop chasing an illusion, to stop seeking something that could never be. He would no longer be a man bound by the need for approval, bound by the ghosts of a love that had long since turned to ashes. He was free. Free to love himself, free to embrace the man he had become, and free to walk away from the illusion that had held him captive for far too long. And in the stillness of the night, he took the first step toward freedom, toward healing, and toward a future where he would no longer live in the shadow of someone else's love, but in the light of his own. With a surge of newfound courage, he made the decision. No, the declaration that it was time to confront her. It was not just a conversation he was preparing for, but a reckoning. He sat across from her, the space between them heavy with years of unspoken words, of lingering resentment that had festered beneath the surface of their once tender bond. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was unshakable. He knew, with a clarity that felt like the first breath of air after being submerged for far too long, that he could not keep living in the shadows of her cruelty. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of his decision, the pain of a heart that had long been bruised but never broken. He told her, plainly, without hesitation, that while he had once loved her with every fiber of his being, he could no longer bear the slow erosion of his dignity, the quiet but relentless humiliation that had become the backdrop of their relationship. Each sharp word, each cold glance, each dismissive gesture had chipped away at him, at his spirit, his sense of self-worth. There was only so much a man could endure before his soul began to fracture. He spoke of the unbearable toll of pretending, of swallowing his hurt for the sake of a love that no longer served him, no longer nurtured him. And then, with the words hanging in the air between them, he declared his truth. He was ready to walk away, to choose himself, to choose a future where he could find peace, where he could rediscover his sense of pride, and where his love would no longer be a weapon used against him. Her reaction was immediate, and it struck him like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She looked at him as though she had seen a ghost, her shock so palpable it almost overwhelmed him. She had never thought him capable of this, of walking away, of finally standing up for himself in a way that shattered the delicate illusion they had built together. It was clear she had never considered that he might find the strength to take back what he had so freely given away. But in that instant, as the reality of his words sank in, he felt a stirring deep within him, a rekindling of the man he used to be. The man who had once been full of laughter, full of passion, full of life before he had been worn down by years of emotional neglect and manipulation. His dignity, which had been quietly suffocated for so long, began to rise from the ashes. It was a feeling he hadn't recognized in years, the feeling of reclaiming what was rightfully his. As the conversation stretched on, painful yet liberating, he could feel the weight lifting from his chest. The words, though heavy, carried with them an undeniable release. He wasn't just leaving her. He was leaving behind the version of himself that had allowed her to diminish him, to make him feel small. He was stepping into a new phase of his life, a phase where he could breathe freely without fear of judgment or condemnation. In that moment, he wasn't just a man facing the end of a relationship. He was a man reclaiming his sovereignty, his autonomy, his very essence. When the conversation finally ended, and he stood to leave, a profound sense of relief swept over him. It was as if the weight of years of emotional turmoil, the countless nights spent in quiet suffering, had been lifted from his shoulders. He had been carrying it all without even realizing just how much it had been holding him back. But now, as he walked away from her home, there was no burden. There was only a sense of lightness, a quiet peace that washed over him like a cleansing rain. His heart was still bruised, but it was no longer broken. It was healing, slowly but surely. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. As he made his way down the street, his mind wandered back to the years they had spent together. He remembered all the moments of joy, of connection, of love that had once seemed so genuine. But now, those memories felt tainted, corrupted by the way they had ended, by the way she had chipped away at him, making him question his worth, his value, until he had nearly forgotten who he was. And yet, in the quiet aftermath of their parting, he finally understood something that had eluded him for far too long. His value was not defined by her, nor by anyone else. His worth was intrinsic, untouched by the external circumstances of his life. He realized with startling clarity that his value did not fade with time, nor with the passage of years. It was not tied to the way he looked, or to how young he appeared, or to any superficial measure. His worth was deep, a quiet strength that had always been within him, waiting to be acknowledged. The more he reflected, the more he saw the truth. He had been so willing to give of himself, to sacrifice his own happiness, in the name of love. But love, as he had come to understand, was not about sacrifice for the sake of someone else's ego. Love was about respect, about mutual care, about seeing the other person not just with your eyes, but with your soul. He had given so much of himself to her, only to find that she had never truly seen him, not in the way that mattered. She had seen only what she wanted to see, and had used that to manipulate him, to keep him in a place of dependence and insecurity. But now he was free, and he was whole. The days that followed were not easy. In fact, they were perhaps some of the loneliest he had ever known. The silence in his home was deafening, an echo of the space she had once occupied in his life. It was a silence that threatened to swallow him whole, that reminded him of all the years he had spent in the shadows of someone else's needs. Yet, in that silence, something unexpected began to stir. It was a quiet, tender realization that, for the first time in a long while, he was not empty. The silence, though sharp and unsettling at first, began to feel like a kind of freedom. A sacred solitude where he could rediscover who he was, without the need to prove himself to anyone. In the solitude, he found peace. Not in the absence of people or love, but in the absence of expectation, in the freedom to be himself, without the constant pressure of living up to someone else's vision of who he should be. He found solace in the small moments, sipping his morning coffee in quiet reflection, walking alone in the park, rediscovering hobbies and interests that had once been neglected. He began to see that even without her, he was still a man full of value, a man with history, a man with a past that shaped him, a man who had lived through hardship and come out the other side stronger for it. And in that quiet, he began to understand the true nature of love. It wasn't about the fleeting excitement of youth, or the physical attraction that fades with time. It wasn't about trying to hold on to a moment that was destined to slip away. True love, he realized, was about respect, kindness, and a deep, unwavering appreciation for the person you were, not for who you could be in someone else's eyes. Love was about acknowledging the beauty in the scars, in the wrinkles, in the wisdom that comes with age. Each line on his face, each gray hair, told a story. A story of survival. A story of strength. A story of a man who had learned, the hard way, that the most important love he would ever need was the love he gave himself. And as he embraced this new chapter in his life, he knew that he would never again allow anyone, no matter how much he loved them, to take that away from him. He was whole. He was enough. And for the first time in his life, he believed it. As we reach the end of this journey, we reflect on the lessons learned. It's a story of rediscovery, of reclaiming dignity, and of learning to love oneself above all else. Life often teaches us the hardest lessons when we are at our lowest, but it is through these trials that we find our truest strength. The courage to walk away from what no longer serves us, the wisdom to know our worth, and the peace that comes with choosing ourselves are powerful gifts we can all embrace. So, what have you learned from this story? Take a moment to reflect. What will you carry forward into your own life from these lessons? I'd love to hear from you. Please share one thing you've learned and how you plan to put it into practice in the comments below this video. If you enjoyed this video and found value in it, please leave your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and remember, your worth is always more than you think.